Hi, Vanessa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, start by telling us about your background and why you wanted to research social influence and social perceptions in the workplace, because I feel like usually people might have had something happen at work in order to actually study that kind of stuff, but you tell me.
It didn't, I guess it sort of happened at work. It more happened in graduate school, but I started out being interested in influence in general. Like when I was in high school, I interned at an ad agency and like got my little ad in the local paper and was very excited. And then after college, I went and worked for Ogilvy and Mather. So I was in New York City at like a big ad agency. And I really kind of had this interest in like just influence as sort of you traditionally think of it. And eventually I went back to graduate school and kind of wanted to take a more academic perspective on it. And I was working with a professor in graduate school my very first year. His name is Frank Flynn. And we were collecting data for a study, and we needed a diverse participant sample. And so I was in charge of doing that since I was a little first year graduate student. And so I would take this sort of packet of questionnaires down to Penn Station every day and have to go up to people and ask them to fill out my little questionnaire to participate in my
Uh,
study.
that sounds rough.
And even you saying that, that's right. Like that's the feeling most people have, I think. And I definitely like I am an introvert. I hated doing this. I
Yeah.
hated going up to people. It was so painful. And eventually I collected enough data and I brought all the surveys up and we entered the data and we looked at it and it turned out the study didn't work.
Oh
And
no.
that's that's actually par for the course pretty much in science. Like so many studies don't work, but it's usually not such a big deal. But for me, this one, like the pain of collecting that data made it so much worse. And so I kind of started going on and on about how upset I was about the study not working because I was like, you don't understand. It was just the worst collecting this data. And it was this interesting moment because Frank was looking at the data I collected, and I had collected, how many people said yes to me and the comments they made. And so he's looking at the objective data while I'm describing this terrible experience. And he was like, I'm hearing you say one thing and I'm seeing something different in the data. And we had this aha moment that the way we think things are going to go in our heads, how negatively we think an interaction is going or has gone is often not the truth if you actually looked from an objective perspective. And so that's really what started my main research focus, which is these misperceptions of the influence we have and misperceptions about how things are going to go, interactions are going to go.
That's so interesting because it's like I was interviewing someone for the show yesterday, and she was saying like when you go in for tough conversations, go in with like the attitude that people mean well, right? And it was so like speaking of what you're saying, it's like so many people even enter, especially work conversations, with like this preconceived notion of like you don't like me so you're already going to say no to me, or this is we already have an attitude with each other, or it was interesting because it was really good advice, but also I was like, god, that's so hard to do also, especially in a workplace. And I know part of your study is you talk about people's lack of self-awareness, also a big piece of that. And it's like goes both ways, right? You can have this lack of self-awareness, but then you can also create this fake awareness too, like, oh, I'm going in there assuming like it's not going to go well. So okay, well, let's get into this a little bit more because this is definitely a thing at work, and I think it also comes up when people need to say no to people at work. So why? Let's talk about why is it hard for us to say no at work, given the your studies around social perception.
Yeah. So if we kind of go back to this experience I was describing, right, of people being essentially more likely to say yes to me than I expected. And in the years since we decided to start testing that experimentally and bringing people into the lab and having them go out and ask people for things, and we find this effect. At this point, we've had our participants ask over 15,000 people for
Wow.
things. We've been doing this for over 15 years now, and it's just a really robust effect that we think people are more likely to say no to us than they actually are. And this kind of gets at this point about how hard it is to say no and how much we don't realize that from the outside, right? When I was asking people, I was so focused on myself and my own insecurities and my own self-consciousness. And kind of, as you said, I was going into it expecting the no, expecting these interactions to go terribly. But on the other side, people were, confronted with this person who was coming up to them. And if you put yourself in their perspective, right, this person's coming up to them and they don't know how to say no to this person.
Yeah, yeah,
And
true.
yeah, like any of us can imagine, like if someone comes up to you and you don't want to be a jerk, right? And you want
Yeah,
to be a nice person, you want to be nice to this person. And so that plays out in the workplace as well. So it's really hard for us to say no in the moment. We often forget this in the abstract and think that it can be pretty easy. And you get this advice like, no is a complete sentence. Like I can't tell
yeah,
you how many people have used that advice. And it's just so hard to articulate that because can you imagine just saying no to someone, right?
yeah,
And in the workplace without any, so it just, in a lot of ways, it's kind of unrealistic to think of it like that, right? No is really hard. And it's hard in general because it's very socially risky or it feels very socially risky to us. So we feel like by saying no, we're risking damaging our reputation. Like we may come across like an uncooperative person.
right.
Um, we risk damaging the relationship because now we've rejected this person, right? And that can lead them to not like us as much. It also risks, offending the other person. So one of my colleagues has this effect that she calls insinuation anxiety. Like it insinuates something about what you think of that person or what they asked you for. And so we don't want to insinuate negative things about other people. We have a lot of anxiety around that. So all those things feel like these big social risks of saying no. And it, you might not consciously think of it, but it shows up in the feeling that like
Yes.
anxiety, the embarrassment, the awkwardness, the guilt, all those feelings are these like evolutionary sort of aspects of all those concerns about like, I don't want to upset this person in my group. And you take that to the workplace, right? And it's exacerbated. So
Yes.
now it's like on top of worrying about my reputation and the person and my relationship, I'm also worried about all the tangible potential effects it could have, right? Like, am I going to miss out on something at work? Is this person going to retaliate in some way? Is this person my boss? And I feel like I really don't have a choice. So all that plays in, it just makes it that much more intense in the workplace.
Yeah, I love that you kind of poked fun at like the advice for people to say, just say no. No is a complete sentence. I find that there's a lot of advice that works very well in an Instagram and a TikTok video, but that does not work well in real life, right? Like when you are sitting across truly from a boss or a person that, and you guys are talking about something related to the project or whatever, you don't just say no. Like it would be a bizarre thing to just say no and end the conversation right there, right? And so there is this like social interaction, or what we, I guess, would call like social graces that are important, or I think help kind of finesse the saying no. So I'm curious, like, what are good examples of how you can say no to something? I mean, sometimes you get asked something and you truly want to do it, and then later on can't, but let's say you are asked something, you're like, in your head, you're like, I am 100% no for this. Like, I cannot do it. I know I have too many things on my plate. I need to say no to this. What are the best ways to say no at work that are not these unrealistic things like no is a complete sentence?
Yeah. So the way I like to think about it is that the best way to say no is to do it mindfully. So to create a space where you don't feel put on the spot, where you don't feel like you can't actually think through whether
Yeah.
you want to do this thing or not. So a lot of times too, the advice is like, just say no. And again, like it's just not realistic. You don't want to say no to everything.
Yeah.
What you want to do is be mindful about the things you're agreeing to.
Yes.
So part of it is giving yourself space and time to think about whether you want to say yes or no. So if you could imagine a situation where someone's, asking you for something right there, face to face in the moment, and you're expected to respond, the first thing is just not to agree right there, to get through that moment without immediately agreeing because there's so much pressure we feel in the moment. And
Yeah.
part of it is that we don't know what to say, right? We have all these concerns in the back of our head that we talked about, like I don't want to seem like a jerk. I don't want to let this person down. What if there's like this, they're upset with me. We have all these things and we want to come up with a way to like get rid of all those worries. But in the moment, who can come up with the perfect words to
Yeah.
say all that, right? So
Yeah.
you need to slow it down and be more mindful. And also think about, what else you have on your plate because implicitly, right? You say every time you say yes to something, you're implicitly saying no to something else,
Right.
right? So it feels harder to actually explicitly say no, but you really are saying no to other things. And it could be things as much as like, hanging out, like it could be work-life balance kinds of things, like hanging out with your kids, getting to go do something, whatever it might be. But so the idea is to kind of slow it down, buy yourself space and time to think about it, like what's actually on your plate, whether you actually want to do this thing, and also give you time to come up with a script that allows you to say no in a way where you get to alleviate all those concerns. So
Yeah.
it's moving on, let me think, I need to check, what else I have going on. I can't think about that right now. Can I just get back to you? And
Hmm.
then think about it, consult, and then you can write an email. I think the best way to respond, and you can even tell someone like, I'll email you back, let me just check on some things. And that gives you the time to think about it, to not have to say no to someone's face, which is often very hard. And it allows you to express yourself exactly, how you feel comfortable doing it. So you can think about like, how am I going to convey that I actually do value this relationship, that I actually do value, being cooperative, that I'm a helpful person. You can find a way to put that all in there,
Yeah.
but still get to say no.
Yeah. I love the idea of sort of like becoming the person that is mindful about what they say yes to, versus just the person who tries to say no to things all the time, right? And I think that just like the reframing of that, I think is also really helpful, especially in the workplace, because as you said, like there are going to be things that you want to say yes to. And socially, you feel that way too. You're like, if I always say no whenever that person invites me somewhere, they're going to stop inviting me, and I don't necessarily want to stop being invited, that kind of thing. Um, I think the workplace is also just full of like these unwritten rules, like you're not allowed to say no to your boss. Even we've written a lot of things about people pleasers, like people pleasing personalities want to say yes, they want to please. And part of, I think, if you're struggling with that, is this is a great technique, is like don't say yes right away. Just get in the habit of like you always take your time to mindfully get back to somebody. And I think that's a really nice thing with writing the email. Especially, you're not trying to burn bridges, how do our feelings of self-consciousness, maybe our own awkwardness and embarrassment affect our willingness to ask others to do something for us? Because sometimes the flip side is happening where you're asking someone and they're gonna say no to you or something like that, right?
Yeah. So, and this is similar to the story about me, like in Penn Station, right? But it happens all the time when we have to ask someone for like advice or help on a project or whatever it might be, or to cover us for something. Yeah. So we worry that asking someone for something is going to reveal something negative about ourselves, right? We worry that they're going to see us as less, competent, potentially, as annoying. It's going to bother them. But in fact, research shows that those fears are overblown. So we think people are going to, think that we're less competent if we ask them for advice. But in fact, when people come to you for advice, you think that they're pretty smart because you're like, oh, well, I know a lot of stuff and yeah, I
Yeah,
can
they
help
usually
you with
love
that.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a misperception. People also are less annoyed in general than we think. They might have to say no, and that's okay. But they're usually not annoyed at you for just asking, particularly for things like a little bit of help, right? And so, and the last thing is that we often worry that people will say no to us, and that worry tends to be overblown. As I said in our studies, people are twice as likely to agree as we think, but just like, the other person who had the advice about, go in assuming good intent, also go in assuming that other people are actually agreeable. Like they want to cooperate with you. They are agreeable. They don't, no one likes to say no. Nobody likes it. So they are already sort of defaulting to saying yes and having to overcome that if they don't want to do something. And so if you kind of acknowledge that in the other person, it changes the dynamic. It changes how you ask. So you feel like, okay, this is actually something someone is inclined to do, right? So I'm going to ask in a way that doesn't like completely eliminate any confidence or any assertiveness or directness in my request. But it also allows you to sort of think about the other person. Like, should I actually be asking for this thing?
Yeah. And what you mean about not getting rid of any of your assertiveness is like, don't be overly apologetic at the fact that you're asking someone, right? So, like, it's actually okay to ask for help. It's actually a good thing to ask for help. I talk about this a lot with like networking because people are like, oh, cold networking is the worst because you're asking complete strangers for advice. It's like, yes, but if you do it the right way, most of the time there's a lot of people out there who will respond and they will help you. It's when it feels very transactional, like, hey, give me, give me, give me, help me, help me, help me. It's all about me, that people are like, I don't know you and I don't have time for that. Like it's there's definitely a right way of asking these things, kind of what we just talked about with the saying no. And I feel like you bring up a really good point about like these are some tips. So like it's not actually that awkward and you don't have to be as self-conscious about doing it. Now look, you might be told no, especially in like a cold networking situation versus somebody you know and you work with closely. My advice has always been like find somebody else, right? Like sometimes being told no, and I don't know if your studies found this too, but like being told no is actually a good thing too. You kind of also have to strengthen that muscle of being like, okay, I didn't get that thing or that person told me no. Now what's my next step, right? You can't always get used to being told yes either.
Yeah, so I have so many responses. That was so many good points. So for one, the idea of the assertiveness, where we started of like not losing the assertiveness or the directness. So we find in our studies that people actually think being indirect is just as effective as being direct. That kind of like hinting like, hey, we should do something along these lines. Like it'd be really great to connect, those kinds of like very kind of unassertive, like hinty kind of approaches are going to be just as effective as, hey, can I do this with you? Hey, will you do this? These like,
Oh,
this is
interesting.
actually what I'm looking for. And so obviously, like the more specific and direct that you are, the more likely you are to actually get that thing because people aren't guessing, like, are you really asking
Yeah,
me for something? Or like, is this really?
right.
Um, and then definitely the no muscle is really fascinating. So first of all, we find that when people hear no, they assume that they're going to get future no's. So like that no, we attribute it too much to like, oh, that person clearly is a no person, or this thing I'm asking is clearly a no thing, right? And they
Yeah.
kind of doubt that relationship and they doubt the thing they're asking for, when in fact, that's often not the case. It's usually just a matter of circumstance, and you do just need to move on, right? And then lastly, one of the things I talk about in my book is something called rejection therapy, which is not a real therapy, but it's a really fun sort of exercise and game almost. But the idea is to get rejected as much as possible, which first of all turns out to be harder than you think, right? Because like if you're expecting rejection all the time, it's like you don't always get it. Actually, it's harder than you think to actually get rejected. But then it also helps you kind of not fall apart from rejection,
Yeah.
right? Like not take it too personally. And I think that muscle is really important to develop.
Well, I think that's especially important for job searchers to hear right now because, the job search, I always joke like nothing will make you feel more insecure than a job search because it's like you get email like a rejection, you get a phone call well, you probably don't get a phone
If
call,
you're
but
lucky, if you're not
yeah, if you're
ghosted,
lucky,
right?
I was gonna say most of the time you just get ghosted, but the rejection's just floating out there in the universe. But every single successful person has been rejected from a ton of jobs. In rejected meaning ghosted or just told you're not the right fit, right? So that's really interesting. Do your studies show a gender aspect to the discomfort of asking?
So this is interesting. In my specific studies, we don't find a gender difference, but there
Ah, okay.
is there is other work where there are gender differences. So I wouldn't say that there aren't gender differences. So you may have heard of the book Women Don't Ask, which
Yeah.
has been a pretty big book by Linda Babcock. And so the way I kind of reconcile the two things is that in our studies, we look at people's like perceptions of what's going to happen. And we actually find that both men and women are pretty underconfident when it comes to asking. Like they don't expect much to happen. They kind of anticipate rejection and like anxiety and all this stuff. But I think it means something different to men and women. That men are like, well, if I get rejected, so what? I'll move on. But women are so worried about being communal and not, rocking the boat because we've been conditioned to care about those things, to make sure everybody likes us and that we're agreeable.
Yeah.
And so even if, like in my studies, both genders kind of react similarly to asking, in the end, it kind of means something different to women where they might just decide not to do it at all, right? I'll just hold back because if it's going to rock the boat that much, if this person is likely to reject me, even if they aren't, right? Why bother asking? Whereas men might be more risk taking in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I hope people do ask because you don't get what you don't ask for. And also, we just talked about how it's almost a good thing to get rejected and to build that muscle. I want to talk about another concept that you have, which is the illusion of courage. What is that?
Yeah, so this is a concept that was found by a psychologist named Leif Van Boven, and he basically showed that we tend to think that other people are, in essence, braver than we are, right? So we have this illusion of courage in other people. So he's done these fun studies where he has people come into a big room and he like blasts, I think it's Rick James, and he says, people are going to randomly be chosen to dance in front of this whole audience on stage. And he asked people, how much money would you need to be paid to do this? And how much money would other people, some other random person in the room need to be paid? And we tend to think that like, oh no, you'd have to pay me a lot of money. I'm not getting up on stage for like less than like a significant amount of money. But we think other people, oh, they'll just do it for a little bit, right? It's not as scary to them. So it's this illusion that other people are more courageous, less impacted by embarrassment is what it comes down to in a lot of ways, than we ourselves are. Like our embarrassment is acute, but other people seems kind of just abstract and like less intense than our own.
Yeah, I can remember, I, like, tripped on the stairwell in high school once, and I was a freshman, and I did it in front of, like, a whole group of senior boys, and this is, like, burned into my memory, and I am still embarrassed about that moment, and it's funny that you say that because, like, I don't think if you ask any of those people, they would ever remember. This means nothing to them, but, like, I still remember that moment, and I also remember my mom being like, "The best thing you can do when you do something embarrassing is to, like, laugh it off, like, make it so it's no big deal." But it's just funny that you say that because like I still have a vivid memory of the like I feel embarrassed talking about it. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
that's funny you say that. The illusion of courage for sure. I also want to talk about so with the saying no, I think like kind of like the sibling of saying no is boundaries and setting boundaries. Do you believe that when you find appropriate ways to say no, mindful ways to say no, that people also start to respect your boundaries? Because one of the things I've found is that if you say yes to everything, you're just like the go along, get along guy. Of course, people start to push over your boundaries. They don't know what your boundaries are, right? You've never set them. What does the research show about boundary setting and saying no?
So this is actually where I like to point out that I feel like too much onus is placed on the people who need to set boundaries to set their own boundaries. Like there's so much advice on getting better at saying no, which I think is great. We do need to get better at saying no. And I do think that once we come up with some scripts that we use, some
Yeah.
techniques, we will get better at it, right? And feel more comfortable doing it. And, I I think also that people should be able to ask for things. I think that's okay, and I think it should be open communication where people feel comfortable asking and also people feel comfortable saying no. But I think we don't kind of advise people asking enough on how to make their ask sort of less pressureful on the people
Yes.
that they're asking, right? So it's okay to ask. We should ask, but we have this idea that we're always getting past no when we ask. And we forget that like actually sometimes we're putting people in these positions where they feel really uncomfortable saying
Yes.
no. And so finding ways to ask where we actually think about, how can I ask in a way that doesn't pressure this person? And we all know like if you get a yes and then the person doesn't want to do it, like that's worse for everybody. Either the
Yes.
person does a bad job or they're annoyed by it, or they bail at the last minute and that just messes everything up. So it helps everybody if you're getting sort of these like truly consensual yeses, right? These like enthusiastic yeses. And so in our lab, we've looked at a couple ways to do this. So one is you can ask in person for things, but you give the person time to respond over email. So just like we talked about, like if you need to get better at saying no, you can buy that time. But ideally, the people asking are giving you that time, right? Like
Yes.
so
Yeah.
with my graduate students, if I have something I'm thinking of for them, but they might not have time to do it, and I kind of make my pitch in person. I say, I have this idea for a project. I think it could be fun, but I want you to really go back and think about your projects and if you can handle this, and then just email me, in a few days if you feel like
Yeah.
you want to do that. And so I'm giving them the space so they don't have to ask for it. right? And the other way that we've been looking at recently in the lab is giving people the language. So we talked about how it's often hard to find the words to say no. So
Yes.
like you're struggling, you're like, I want to say no, but I need to say it in a way that makes me, feel okay and makes us all okay. But if you ask people and say, we often say like, it's okay if you want to say no, right? When we look at that in the lab, that doesn't do anything. Everyone knows it's okay, like
Yeah.
they know they're allowed to. That doesn't add anything. But if you say like, I, will you do this for me? If you can't, just tell me X. And you kind of give them the words, you give them a script to say back to you. They know exactly what to say. They don't have to struggle for the words and they feel much more comfortable saying no. And so we found that to be the case in the lab, that telling people how to say no is more effective than telling them that they can say no.
Interesting. I totally follow what you're saying too about let's stop putting the onus on everybody to draw these really strict boundaries, and maybe let's put more of the onus on when someone is setting a boundary, respect it, right?
Yeah.
I was in a class thing the other day, and the woman was basically letting us know, like, I can't teach on Fridays anymore. And everyone was like, oh no, like that's the day. And finally, someone said, Mary is trying to set a boundary and no one is respecting it. And that like blew my mind because I thought that is exactly what's happening. She's politely telling people, I can't do this thing on Fridays anymore. And all these other people are saying, but Fridays work for me. So how can we bully you into going back to Fridays or make you feel so bad about this that you'll come back and teach this class on Fridays? And I completely agree. The people who were kind of asking her about it, they should have respected the fact that she was drawing a line. And I believe too, it would be easier to set boundaries and say no if there was more of that reciprocal relationship. Like if you didn't have to say no 5 times to somebody, you'd probably be better and more comfortable saying no. But there are those people at work where you're like, I have to say no 5 times, and it's like painful for me and them. So I'm just going to start saying yes to them because what's the point, right? We do work for people. So hopefully this podcast will get to those people where it's like also the self awareness of like be aware when someone is drawing that boundary and telling you no, right?
Yeah, and I mean, recognizing that that's really hard for people to do, and
Yes.
they often do it in a less assertive way than they feel inside, because it is so hard. I also like there's some companies that when it comes to like romantic requests in the workplace, they have like a only ask once policy, and I love that for everything. Like people
Yeah.
shouldn't have to say no 5 times. It should be like only ask once. If they say no, like that's the answer, right?
Yeah. I love that. And like for managers who are listening, like that's something that you could implement on your team to create a way more respect when it comes to the no and the boundaries thing. And within it's funny, Slack has this thing where people can set their hours, and if you send a Slack message outside of their hours, it basically gives you this note like this is outside of their hours. Do you want us to notify them anyways? And I never hit yes, notify them anyways, unless it's truly like an emergency, like, hey, this thing is broken and we need to fix it ASAP. But I think that's really funny because it's like a reminder of like, hey, do you want me to interrupt this person outside of this working hours? Like how much work is that? And so hopefully some of the technology we're using for remote and hybrid work will also help with this a little bit, just because your point of like saying no in writing is a little bit easier than in person. Okay, I want to wrap up by so your book is called You Have More Influence Than You Think. So I want to wrap up with just your final thoughts on influence and influencers, even maybe, because I feel like influencers used to be just this thing that was on Instagram, but I also feel like building influence at work is a very important skill. So can we talk a little bit about that, some key takeaways of you have more influence than you think?
Yeah, for sure. So, and one of the takeaways is that essentially, that's it's kind of like a like a cheesy way to say it, but like we're all influencers, right? So that's
Yes.
part of the takeaway of the book. And one of the things I talk about is that people end up seeing us, like watching the things we do, listening to the things we say, actually listening to us and changing their minds because of things we say, and doing things for us when we ask them more than we think. So I run through a bunch of studies that basically show that we do impact people regularly all the time in ways that we don't always see. And so some of the main takeaways are, show up. So we often think like, what's the point of me being in that meeting? I don't really have anything to say. But simply by being present in meetings, other people notice that you're there, and that might
Yes.
shape how they talk about a topic, right? Oh, you're seeing your face reminds me that you care about these kinds of things. So let's talk about those, right? Also, raising issues and voicing things and even giving compliments, things as simple as that, all that stuff actually matters more than we think. We think we have to be perfectly articulate and have things, perfectly formulated to make an impact, but often just saying like, I don't have a good reason for this, but here's my gut feeling about this, right? Can shape a conversation. Like people take that seriously. And then asking, not assuming that people are going to say no, as we talked about earlier, knowing that in fact, in many cases, people want to agree with the things that we ask them for. And so we should go ahead and ask. It doesn't have as many negatives as we think, right? It can have a lot of positives as long as we're not, abusing that, as long as we're not doing like the ask 5 times kind of thing. And as long as we're asking in ways, that allow the other person to say no.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, some tips would be when you ask someone for something, give them the script to be able to say no back to you. And that, like, just that subtle shift would be really important. And then on the flip side, before you say yes to something, always tell someone, oh, thanks for asking me about that, or come up with your script, however they ask it. Let me think about that and I'll get back to you in writing. Write it down on your
Yep.
post it note so that you remind yourself to get back to someone. I think these are really, really good tips. And I think it will really help with the whole setting boundaries, how to say no at work. And it's so much more helpful than no as a complete sentence. So thank you for sharing these today.
Absolutely.
Where can people find you, follow your work, buy your book, all the things?
So I have a website, vanessabohns.com, and Bonds is Bohns. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter at Prof Bonds, and on LinkedIn if you want to connect there.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.